And I really enjoyed listening to Greg. And he told the audience a really astounding story that I wanted to relate very quickly to show people that these things are happening. And when I say these things, I'm specifically referring to the military oppressing people and killing people who get too close to the truth. Because Greg Everson has actually experienced and been involved in a lot of classified things that he doesn't talk about on the radio. But anyways, right. Greg related a story that I don't remember all the details. People can go and listen to the DVDs. They can purchase them on stevequayle.com from the conference and listen to Greg's whole presentation. But they can probably find this story somewhere online too. But Greg, one day, in a nutshell, and I'm going to leave out all the details, but in a nutshell, Greg was sitting in his house one day, and somebody shot him in the forehead. Not exactly in the forehead, above one of his eyes, above one of his brows, I think, eyebrows, with some kind of a device. And he actually saw the weapon being discharged from the forest because he had some woods around his house, and he was struck with this, whatever it was, and he started to have, and basically what appeared to be what I think he thought was an aneurysm. So right. They basically tried to fry the man's brains. So when we talk about people being taken out with these high-tech devices, the one I referred to that the CIA had to admit that they had, the one that induces a heart attack, or alternatively the kind of weapon that was used against Greg Everson, we're talking about reality. We're talking about people who have paid the ultimate price for coming out with the details and telling the truth about this stuff that have been suppressed and oppressed and in some cases terminated by this shadowy military group that's working in the black budget and in the black projects world. So now let me tie all of this back in before I get too far off track here. So the reason why I got to that story concerning Greg Everson was because we were talking about the military's involvement. And I mentioned the term MILAB, which stands for military abductions, because what happened was the military was monitoring, as I said, the abduction phenomenon, especially in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, monitoring the abduction phenomenon, tapping the phones of the abductees and surveilling the abductees in a very oppressive way. Sometimes an abduction would happen, and like I said, after the aliens were done with the person, the military would come and subject the person again to a very forceful interview. Sometimes black helicopters would show up above the people's house, and military personnel would swamp the property and basically confiscate any artifacts, any evidence that was left over. And what the military actually began to do was they began staging their own abductions. And this is really insidious. We're getting into some very dark stuff here. The military would actually begin to perpetrate abductions and blame it on aliens and masquerade as aliens. And so the military was beginning to copy the abduction protocols of these aliens, and they were doing that for a number of reasons, involving mind control, involving a lot of experimental technology that they were using. The military was trying, one of the things that the military was really interested in was figuring out what the implants were, what the purpose and function of the implant was, and they wanted to reverse engineer it. They wanted to be able to develop their own implants. And so, wow. And there is some legend about this, and I don't know, I can't verify that this is true. I happen to believe it is, that there's actually some sort of an agreement signed between President Eisenhower and a non-human faction that gave this particular faction of non-humans the right or the leave to abduct a certain amount of human beings, a certain amount of Americans specifically, in exchange for technology. So there has been an exchange of technology between the human race and non-human entities, and it's not the first time it's happened.
That's right.
This was, and I'm not going to go into all the roots, the Genesis 6 roots and all that. But anyways, tying this back into the black-eyed children, I mentioned that there was a breeding program. I want to give people a reference here. If people want to get a feel for the abduction phenomenon, I think, in my opinion, the best resource that I've personally come across, and I've looked into this, and I've watched hours of presentations and read different books on the abduction phenomenon. And in my opinion, I think the most unbiased researcher was a woman by the name of Carla Turner. Carla Turner is dead. She died of a very, very aggressive form of cancer I think she was murdered with cancer, in other words. But Carla Turner wrote 3 books. She wrote a book called Taken, which details the abduction phenomenon. All of her books detail the abduction phenomenon, but Taken, I think it goes through the stories. I think 8 separate women details their lives and their abduction stories. Then she wrote Masquerade of Angels, which details the life of a gentleman named Ted Rice, which is fascinating, and his whole abduction, his whole relationship with the abduction phenomenon. And then I think the first one she wrote was Into the Fringe, which was the story of her whole family was abducted and was subjected to not only alien abduction but military abduction. And anyone who's interested in getting a feel for what the abduction phenomenon is about should refer to those books. I think that Carla Turner, she does a fantastic job, and she takes an objective view, even though she was an abductee herself. She tries to take an objective view, in many cases even a skeptical view, and she does a fantastic job of really documenting the details in a way that very few people have since Carla Turner's work. Now, I will give this disclaimer. Carla Turner, to my knowledge, was not a believer, so she did not have a biblical paradigm on the abduction phenomenon. That might have changed at the end of her life, because there are some clues in the books that lead me to suspect that Carla Turner may have uncovered the truth and received Jesus before she died. I don't know if that's true. I hope it is, but I'm not sure it is. Anyways, I just wanted to give that resource out there. Her books are free online in PDF, in a PDF format. People can type in Carla Turner books. They'll find them there for free. They're purposely free. Her husband made them free online after she died. So now the interesting thing is that in most abduction cases involving, I talked about last time we were on the radio, last time I was on the radio with you guys, I talked about artificial insemination. This is something that happens in many cases where women are abducted. It's very common that a woman is abducted, subjected to the run-of-the-mill abduction scenario where she's taken out of her bed, consciously taken out of her bed by these little gray entities, which people refer to as gray aliens or alien grays. And they're the typical little guys with the big heads and the big almond-shaped eyes. They have that gray chalky skin. That's actually the kind of skin they have. I personally think they're biological drones, but that's for a whole other discussion. But anyways, they take these women and they take them up into their craft, and these women are usually laid out on a table similar to an operating table and are subjected to different medical procedures. In many cases, are subjected to some very erotic sexual procedures as well. And many times, the women are artificially inseminated. And for those who don't know what artificial insemination is, it refers to the deliberate introduction of sperm, of any kind of sperm, into a female's uterus or cervix for the purpose of achieving a pregnancy through in vivo fertilization by means of something other than sexual intercourse. Most cases involve a syringe being plunged into the woman's uterus and this seed being artificially injected into their uterus. And the seed that's injected into these women is most often, appears to be most often the seed of either a hybrid entity or a entity related to the aliens that are abducting the woman. So basically, the woman is artificially inseminated. In some cases, the woman doesn't give birth. I mean, in most cases, the woman doesn't give birth. In some cases, the woman does give birth, and the military tracks a lot of this and has confiscated the evidence. But in some cases, the woman will have a miscarriage, and there have been documented cases where a woman has a miscarriage. And you referenced from the book of Esdras last time we were on the program, where it talks about your women shall give birth to monsters, a prophecy concerning the end times. And literally, these women, they discharge from their bodies in the form of what do you call it when a baby comes out before it's supposed to and it's dead? I just lost
premature or stillborn.
A miscarriage. So the woman discharges this creature in the form of a miscarriage, and it's not human. It's most often in a very ugly aberration. But in a lot of the cases, the women are pregnant. They're literally carrying a baby. They have verification from doctors and so forth that they're pregnant. And then suddenly, the baby in their womb is gone. It disappears. What happens is they're abducted again, and the baby is extracted from their womb. And many times, when a woman is artificially inseminated and carries a baby to term, and the baby disappears, the woman is abducted a couple of years later, or sometimes a year later, and introduced to the hybrid that came as a result of her pregnancy. And those hybrids, ironically, resemble the black-eyed children. In many cases, the hybrids resemble these black-eyed children, and they have many times, not always, there's different, depending on whatever they're using, whatever seed genetic material they're using that's mixing with the woman's egg, you're going to get a different result. But in many cases, you have these children with very abnormally large heads, abnormally large eye sockets. Their eyes are black. Their hair is usually scraggly. Most often it's blonde, but not always blonde. And they are almost always described as having chalky white skin and being pale and sickly looking. And when they speak, some of them are what's the term? They're telepathic. They're empathic or telepathic, and they sometimes they have the ability to speak using their mind, communicating with their mother. And sometimes they speak using their voice. And when they speak using their voice, Marcus, what do you think they sound like? Exactly as you described. Monotone, robotic, somewhat human, but not entirely human.
Yeah, so that was the description I was given. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, there's this hybridization program that I'm sure L.A. Marsuli had probably mentioned on your show, and there's this hybridization program that is underway and has been underway for a long time. And I have my own speculations as to why this program, what they're doing. A lot of people in the ufology community have different opinions. Many people think that what they want to do is integrate a new hybrid species into human society. They're trying to perfect a hybrid, a alien human hybrid, to where it can be flawlessly integrated into society without people knowing that they're there. I think they've done that. I think they have achieved that. I think we literally have walking among us hybrids that were the result of artificial insemination. And by the way, it goes both ways. The sexual stuff, men are oftentimes abducted and semen is extracted, and in many cases these men are subjected to sexual situations in which they're forced to have sexual intercourse with hybrid creatures, female creatures that are hybridized to look somewhat like human women, but are obviously not fully human. So it goes both ways. Let me tell you something. The data, referring to that hard data that proof, that hard proof, the data concerning these abductions is so overwhelming. As I mentioned earlier, it is so incredibly overwhelming that your first reaction, if you look at it with an open mind and you approach it seriously, your first reaction is, how in the world has this remained hidden? Because there's so much data, there's so much information, so much eyewitness testimony, so much physical evidence. It is everywhere, but it has been carefully concealed from the eyes of the public, as so many things have. And people, you know, the most ignorant question that I hear people, I was listening to the radio here in Montana, the local radio, the other day while I was driving home on a highway, and somebody called into a radio program because the hosts of the program were discussing ISIS and some political things concerning ISIS. And a gentleman called in and began to reference the Illuminati, began to reference the Luciferian agenda and the global elite and everything that's happening behind the scenes. And the hosts of the program began to instantly, almost as if it were programming, instantly began to mock the man. And the man was presenting his case eloquently.
Wow.
I mean, this man was presenting this case in such a succinct manner. He was laying it out within 2 minutes. I mean, I was very surprised. I thought he did a fabulous job in just 2 minutes, just laid out who's funding ISIS, why, what's going on behind the scenes, the global elite, and he did a fantastic job. And he was referencing facts. What do you think the response of these two talking political heads was? It was instantly to mock him. It wasn't to address the facts that he had brought up. It was instantly, as if they were programmed to just mock him. Of course, to throw the word conspiracy at him, to mock him, and basically the question their big question was, there's no way that this kind of thing could be hidden. There's no way. There's no way. And now, it's interesting that a logical thinking human being would utter those words without taking a panoramic view of modern history and taking a look at all the things that were covered up and are covered up to this day, but especially the things that were cover-ups and came to light, how successfully they were covered up, how media has become a tool to absolutely brainwash people. Every form of media, by the way, music, television, movies, every form of media has been literally engineered. Listen, television was engineered not to entertain you, but to brainwash you. Okay? I can't go into the details now. Take my word for it or go do some research. Television was engineered to brainwash people. It is, you are supposed to think a certain way, and if you don't question the way that you are innately brought up in your culture, then you are going to live your life with your eyes closed, because you're going to extract or derive all of your information about the world in which you live from the media. In the beginning, it was newspapers, which have always for many years, have been owned by the ruling factions, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and so on, and have been manipulating the news. But then, of course, it went to an even grander medium, which was television. And that's why, by the way, that's why we've got so many crooked, despicable televangelists that have popped up, because television was engineered for lies and liars. And so it was the natural breeding ground for those kinds of despicable characters, and those are the kind of people that are promoted on that medium. And not to say that everything that comes across on television is wrong and evil, and of course people can use it for good and blah, blah, blah. I don't want to get into that conversation, but my point is that because of how dumbed down we are as a society now, a global society, but especially in the West, because of how dumbed down we are by media, it is supremely easy to pull a fast one on us. Supremely easy to mislead everybody. I mean, come on, Obama. I mean, the Obama administration is the greatest example of that. I mean, look at all the scandals that have. I mean, has the guy been pinned down on even one of the scandals yet? No. I mean, it's obvious that media is a tool to literally brainwash people into having a worldview that rejects the kinds of things that we're talking about tonight. But interestingly enough, these things are going to come to light, and they're going to purposely come to light in the future. The aliens, the UFOs, all the different technology that we've been deriving from them or have been given by them or have reverse engineered as a result of recovering their craft or shooting them down, which we can. And it's going to come out, but it's going to come out in a way that that they want it to come out, so that we walk away with the perception of the whole affair that they have engineered. It's called social engineering. They engineer the way that we act in its culture. They engineer the culture. When I say they, of course, there's different hierarchies at work. You've got a human faction at work, and then you've got a non-human faction at work, which, of course, we understand that the top of that hierarchy is Satan. And that's not Sunday school mythology. It's biblical fact. And you've got minds behind the scenes that are working on this stuff that are incomprehensible to the human mind. And I'm not aggrandizing the powers of darkness. I'm just pointing to raw facts. We ought to be able to be big boys and girls and deal with raw facts and reality. My God, we consume like gluttonous pigs. We sit there in front of televisions and consume all this crap, all this fiction all day long, believing whatever garbage that they tell us. We ought to be able to, as I said, be mature enough to digest and to deal with the truth when it comes across our plate. So, and I know that this kind of conversation offends people because, frankly, we've been engineered to be offended by truth. We've been engineered we've been engineered in such a way that when the truth is presented, our knee-jerk reaction is to doubt, illogically doubt. I mean, and then truth is presented to us in a skewed way. When they do present the truth to us, they present it to us in the form of a television program like Star Trek or Star Wars, where they're telling us what actually exists to some degree, but they're not telling us as if we're mature, respectable human beings. They're telling us as if we're idiots, as if we're cockroaches, as if we're undeserving to be spoken to directly about these things. That's part of the reason why they do that. Part of the reason is a very intentional contempt that they have for us, that those who are in the know, that the secret ruling factions, whether they be the military factions, the political factions, or the banking factions, know, they have the knowledge, and they make fun of us for being so blind and stupid and ignorant, and they feed our gluttony, they feed our ignorance. They don't want us to think logically. And if people would think logically, and if they would listen to a contention, whether it be a biblical contention or whether it be in contention involving something like alien abductions. When I say contention, I mean something that's contentious to their minds, rather than stepping back and saying, why is this contentious to my mind? Why is there a mechanism that seems to be built into the fabric of my mind that is repelling this without utilizing logic? In other words, why am I repelling this without analyzing it? Well, let me tell you why. It's called programming. Programming exists, and we've all been programmed to a degree. All of us have been programmed to a degree by culture at this point. And because we're dealing with a sophisticated technocracy. We're dealing with technocrats that are working with, that have access to technology that is 1,000 years in advance of what we have now. We can't even comprehend the technology that they're using to dupe us. Okay, let me say that again. We can't even comprehend the technology that they're using to fool us. So when we say, how could this be hidden for so long or whatever, we're not even able to analyze on a fair playing field how they're doing it, because we don't know exactly what they're using to do to pull the wool over everybody's eyes, except for to have the understanding that the media is involved, that churches are involved, that politics are involved. It is a brainwashing on a global scale. And remember, we are the postmodern generation. We live in the postmodern era. Hey, we're talking on a medium that's only existed for what, less than 100 years or something like that. No, I'm sorry. I was speaking as if we were talking on the radio. We're not. We're talking through the internet. So we're talking through a medium here that's only existed, since the 90s. Okay, so. Or since the 80s, if you want to count the government using it, the internet, before it went public. The government, of course, had developed a form of internet that they were using internally. So, in other words, we're using a technology that our grandparents, my grandfather, when he was a little boy, people were still using horses and buggies, right? Yeah. So when my grandfather died, he was 94 when he died, or 95, and when he was born, when he was a little toddler, people were still using horses and buggies. I mean, cars were just starting to come out in the early 20th century, but a lot of people couldn't afford cars, obviously, and so horses were still. I mean, when my grandfather was a little boy, there were still cowboys, and it was still the wild, wild west in certain places of this country.
Right.
All right. So we take for granted where we have come in terms of this technological leap. And where did this technological leap come from? Just the astounding ingenuity of modern man? Bullcrap. Excuse my French. Yeah. But there's no way. It's not a matter of mankind suddenly having an epiphany and we develop all of this crazy technology, the Industrial Revolution and so forth. Now, the Industrial Revolution, by the way, okay, that's one thing. The Industrial Revolution and began to develop somewhat organically. I'll give you that, somewhat organically. But there came a point in time where we started just making leaps and bounds in certain technologies to the point where now all of our major technologies, informational technologies especially, are on an exponential growth curve. I referenced that last time I was on the radio with you, an exponential growth curve. And in other words, the technologies are doubling and tripling and quadrupling in their level of advancement every year. And I don't have all the exact data in front of me, but we're not growing incrementally in a linear fashion. We are making leaps and bounds in technology behind the scenes in many cases that are going to fundamentally change this planet and our human DNA in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years in ways that this planet has never before seen or witnessed. That's the reality in which we live. And the implications of what I'm talking about are massive, beyond what anybody can really comprehend, but yet we take it for granted. Most people are just glued to their cell phones all day long, texting and Facebook, and here they are using all this technology, not really putting the pieces together. They're not engaging logically what the consequences are. They're using Common Core logic rather than traditional logic. 2 + 2 = 5. It doesn't equal 4 anymore. So they're not able to put together. And when I say they're not able, the majority of young people out there now who are so engrossed in this stupid society that we have now, the majority of these young people are no longer able to access the capabilities that they have innately as human beings. They're no longer able to. They've been dumbed down to such a degree, programmed to such a degree, that they are no longer able to access some of those faculties. Instead, they simply revert to technology to do the things that the human brain was supposed to do 100 years ago. And so they're actually losing the capability. I shouldn't say losing the capability. I should say they're actually losing the ability to utilize the capability that exists in the human brain. And I'm not talking about to basically use the force and make things levitate with your mind. I'm talking about the ability, the capability of critical thought, of logical analysis. Okay, it's dissipating in my generation, and especially in the generation behind me, and it's purposely being basically replaced with artificial intelligence, so that we don't have to use those faculties anymore, because all we have to do is rely on Google. Well, how dangerous is that? Because the computer is going to be thinking for us in the future, and not just on in terms of calculations, not just in terms of being a massive calculator to compute raw data that the human mind just isn't capable of computing, not in our fallen state anyway. So that's not the kind of processing that I'm talking about. I'm talking about processing basic information. In other words, people are going to have to turn to Google in 10 years to answer questions that they should have known in kindergarten. I'm serious.
Wow.
They are going to have to ask Google the questions that our teachers asked us when we were little kids, and that we were supposed to be able to answer. Think about that. Because we've been so dumbed down. Because we've been so dumbed down. Google can tell them anything it wants to.
That's right. Again, more conditioning. Timothy, do you think that that's why they have the audacity to call us useless eaters, because we've been so duped as we eat the garbage they spit out to us every day?
Of course. Well, that's one of the reasons why they call us useless eaters, but the traditional use of the term useless eaters was for those who were not beneficial to society, so they were useless eaters. They weren't contributing enough to society to warrant being fed, to warrant eating food and living. Of course, that was a phrase that came out of Leninism and communism. But now you're right. Now it's not so much that we're not useful in society. Now we're useless eaters because we're not even really functioning like human beings anymore. And when I say we, obviously I'm not addressing you and your audience. Just the fact that people are listening to your show shows that proves that that's not the case for them. And obviously for the audience that listens to the Hagmans and Alex Jones and is searching for the truth and researching, obviously this doesn't apply to them. But for the majority of these people, people keep using the term zombie, and I'm going to get back to the abduction stuff and the black-eyed children here before we close this out. But people use the term zombie and zombified. Well, and some people use it tongue in cheek, and people snicker about it. And even my family jokes with me, and they always joke and say that I moved out to Montana to escape the zombie apocalypse, which isn't entirely false, but it's not true in the way they think it is. But listen, what else do you call a human being that is so spiritually and mentally dead that they have almost completely lost touch with what they were designed to be in the beginning, that they almost have that they've almost completely lost their capability to access the faculties that are innate in the human genetics. In other words, that they have brains just like everybody else, but they don't know. It's like a child. They don't know how to process thoughts anymore. They don't know how to process logic and be analytical and be linear in their thought process, because they've been bombarded with just asinine, ridiculous crap through television and Facebook. I tell my wife all the time, I always tell her, Facebook, people post lots of stuff on Facebook and try to wake people up, but I always notice that nobody cares if you post something on Facebook about aliens or giants or genetics. But if you post, and everybody knows this is true, if you post a 2-minute video or a 10-minute video about a cat eating ice cream, everybody will watch that video, and they'll watch it over and over and over, and they'll pass it around.
Right.
And why? Because that video is engaging the basis, most rudimentary mechanisms in your brain. But a video that talks about, that analyzes, that's analytical and logical, especially dealing with biblical doctrines or scientific stuff or genetics or giants or something like that, that kind of information engages a different part of your brain. It forces you to go to a different level in your thought process. And I'm gonna make a statement. People can't handle it anymore. They're not only they're not only disinterested in it, they are dysfunctional in their thought process at this point. They've lost the ability to digest and analyze that kind of information. And I didn't think like this 10 years ago, but I lived in Peru for 10 years, and after coming back here a few years ago and just analyzing the social climate of this country and of the Western world in general, it's scary. It's not even funny. It's scary what's happening to the human race. We think we're getting smarter because we know how to use technology. We know how to press buttons. We know how to press the buttons that allow technology to think for us. So therefore, we're smart. All those Neanderthals were so stupid, but look at us. We're so smart because we can put a post on Facebook. We know how to tweet, right?
Yeah.
But really, people don't understand that we are probably the dumbest generation of human beings. We may be the dumbest generation of human beings who ever have existed on this planet. Take away our technology, and man, I'll tell you what, we are in a pitiful state.
We'd be in trouble.
We're in a pitiful state. Take away our technology, and we are in a pitiful state. And I'm going somewhere with this, and I don't mean to rant here, but the idea here is that, referring back to the cover-up concerning the abduction phenomenon, we are no longer able, not we as in us listening to this show, participating in this show. I'm not referring to we. I'm referring to we as the human family collectively. We are not even able to process truth anymore, Marcus. And I'll tell you what, when you talk about preaching the gospel to people today, you need the anointing of the Holy Spirit, because people have to be supernaturally impacted. I'm talking about an awakening. They have to have the epiphany of the gospel that only God can give.
That's
because
right.
Most people are not even able to think on logical terms anymore, and that is my rant for the evening.
Well, let me just try to visit a couple of things here. You've done a superb job of bringing us to a point where we as believers tonight must understand and be willing to deal with these things that exist and things that we've been told that don't exist. You know, Timothy, the Lord, he gave me a couple of things the other day, and I'm just going to throw a couple out and see if I can get your input on it. But, you know, I think it was 2 days ago, the Lord just dropped in my spirit. He said, Marcus, you're going to see the creature feature generation. And it took me back, and I began just to, converse with the Lord and said, well, Lord, give me some insight as to what you mean by that. And he basically told me to look at the, bodily modifications that certain people in our society are engaging in. Some people are having their bodies modified to look like reptiles, snakes, vampires, or whatever. But what the Lord told me after that, he said, this is just the beginning of the worst that you're soon to see. Timothy, I don't know how much more aberrant it can become based on what we've already seen. But it obviously is going to become much more than we bargained for. And I think that right now we're under a full-scale Illuminati immersion in our society. And it has dumbed us down, so much. And, going back to the alien abduction scenario and the, breeding programs, even some perhaps conservative Christians would debunk, criticize, jest, laugh, or mock at these type of subjects. But Brother Timothy, I know you know, and I trust others will learn that there have been people that have, like you said, paid the price of their own life for divulging these types of informations. And one that was brought to my mind, and you can go to YouTube and they can look at this for themselves. But you're probably familiar with the name Phil Schneider. Can you just talk for a moment about that scenario and bring to the attention of our listeners? This man paid a price for his life about what he brought to the public.
Yes, Phil Schneider is an intriguing person. He's dead now. He was murdered. But
yes.
Phil, to give you a little bit of background, I have a video up on an Alberino analysis on underground bases, on DUMBs, deep underground military bases, in which I tell Phil's story, and then I let Phil tell his story on the video himself. I edited in one of his lectures so people can actually go to the Alberino analysis on the underground bases, deep underground military bases, and at the end of that analysis is Phil Schneider relating some of the information that he would commonly relay to people while he was on the lecture circuit. So Phil Schneider's father was a U-boat captain during the Nazi regime, and so his father was brought over to the United States under Project Paperclip, and so Phil had a history of being connected to some of these secret government programs, and his father was a brilliant man. He had ties to the Philadelphia experiment. People can Google that and see what that was about. But basically, Phil Schneider was an accomplished geologist, a structural engineer, and an explosives expert. And he worked on black budget projects for the United States military and multinational private contractors. Now, Phil possessed a level 3 Rhyolite 38 security clearance, which is a real security clearance, and which there were only a handful of civilians, because Phil was a contractor with the military. He wasn't actually in the military. So there were only a handful of civilians who held that Rhyolite 38 level 3 security clearance. And that security clearance gave Phil Schneider access to some of the stuff we're talking about tonight, information, access into some of those classified files that have the information of the stuff we're talking about tonight. And by the way, he had a near genius level IQ, and there's a lot of documentation. There was a lot of documentation proving that Phil was who he said he was. Most of it was confiscated, but it was out there long enough to where people had documented it, filmed it, taken photos of it before they confiscated it after they killed Mr. Schneider. But Phil's primary occupation involved the design and construction of deep underground military bases, or DUMBs as they are known,
right?
Including some of the most infamous installations on the planet, such as the Area 51 and S4 facilities in Nevada, as well as the Los Alamos and Dulce facilities in New Mexico. And I know, Marcus, you're familiar with the Dulce site in New Mexico. And
very much.
Basically, Phil, through a very bizarre circumstance, actually a very bizarre set of circumstances, discovered that there was a nefarious conspiracy involving an alleged collusion between factions in the United States military and a technologically advanced non-human race that was actually in possession of this of some of the technology that we've now reverse engineered. But not only that, but also we're living under the earth, some of these entities. It's not one, it's many, in caverns in the earth. And Phil has a particular story in which he actually encountered these entities while he was working on the underground base. I believe it was at the Groom Lake facility, and he was building an extra chamber to the underground base. By the way, these underground bases are miles below the surface of the earth. We're not just talking about an underground base that, you go down a few flight of stairs and you're in the base. We're talking miles under the ground,
right.
very high-tech facilities. And so Phil Schneider, basically, he was the one who determined, based on the rock sediment that they were dealing with and the rock formations that they were dealing with, he would have to determine what kind of explosives or what explosive package that he would use to break up the earth under the ground. And they were drilling down on this particular occasion. The government was there and all the geologists that were working. It was a top secret classified project. They were building onto the underground base, building some more chambers onto the underground base, and the drill kept getting hung up on something. It kept getting bent, or smoke was coming up, and the drill kept grinding to a halt, and it was encountering some kind of sediment that was unusual. So they sent Phil Schneider down the shaft, the drilling shaft, with, I don't know how many guys were with him. I know at least one. I think it was a Green Beret was with him.
Right.
And Phil Schneider had a little PPK pistol on him, and they were both in environmental suits, basically space suits. And they went down the shaft in the basket. They were lowered down the shaft to determine what kind of sediment they were encountering down there. Why was the drill coming up? By the way, there were foul stenches coming up too from this hole that they had drilled down. And I don't remember how far down, but it was far down in the earth. And basically, this basket went down with Phil and this military person in it, in their environmental suits. And when they got down far enough, they came into an open space, an open cavern. And of course, they had their lighting gear on them, their flashlights and whatever else gear they had. And what Phil found, shocked him, literally and emotionally speaking, and also physically speaking, because there was this cavern, and there were these entities. He said they were about 7 to 8 feet tall. I think that's, if I remember right, they were around 7 feet tall, if I remember his 7.5, something like that, his description. And they were almost a typical description of a gray alien, but tall. They were tall, larger forms, or what are known as the large grays. They were with their chalky white skin. They were hideous. They stank. There was a very demonic atmosphere, and one of these entities, when Phil was lowered down the basket, and I know we're running out of time here, waved his hand in front of its chest, and Phil was actually struck with some kind of energy pulse or beam that literally burned off two or three of his fingers on one of his hands, and he uses the phrase crispy crittered his toes and gave him an aggressive form of cancer. And so Phil bore that evidence in his body, and the fact that he had these missing fingers, and everything he said was verifiable. Long story short, Phil Schneider was killed. There were 12 attempts on his life within 1 year or 2 years, and they got him on the 13th, and they killed him by choking him out, tying his hands behind his back and choking him out with a catheter, choking him to death after they tortured him and beat him up. So Phil Schneider, and there's some other stories there's a lot of stories involving Phil Schneider and his good friend Al Bielek. People can Google Phil Schneider, Al Bielek. Again, you're not going to get a biblical perspective on this stuff. You've got to go to the scriptures and find the biblical perspective on this stuff, and it's there, believe me. I just want to give that disclaimer. But Phil was an extraordinary person and a very brave person. And he walked around with artifacts, by the way, artifacts that came off of some of the reverse engineered, or some of the non-human technology, some of the craft, and some of the reverse engineered craft. He actually had artifacts. He had some metals that are not even on the periodic table, because the periodic table you're taught in school isn't the real periodic table. There's at least a dozen new elements that have been discovered because of our interaction with these non-human entities. And that, of course, they don't tell us about. Phil actually had some of these elements that he would bring around with him on the lecture circuit, and he had documentation proving his assertions. And basically, they killed him and took everything. They took everything from him, and